A cautionary tale of taking what we find in reference books as gospel. Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and first up I want to say straight off the bat, this isn't any kind of attack or besmirching the reputation of Ewart Oakeskott. Ewart Oakeskott, who wrote Records of the Medieval Sword, Sword in the Age of Chivalry, and a whole bunch of other books, Archaeology of Weapons, that you should all have on your bookshelves if you're interested in this kind of stuff. Ewart was a lifelong connoisseur and collector of antiques. A little bit like myself, but he was collecting medieval stuff primarily. Although, as I understand it, he also had a love of small swords as well. And I know various people who knew Ewart. Unfortunately, he's no longer alive, died over a decade ago, I think now. But a number of people I know knew him. Some of them knew him quite well. Several people I know worked with him, and he was undeniably a massive influence on hundreds and hundreds of people who are interested, particularly in medieval, but also Renaissance as well, period, swords, armour, history, everything else. And he wrote a whole bunch of books. He was very prolific, and these books are an incredible resource. Okay, so I don't want to undermine that at all, and you should all have all of Ewart Oakeskott's books on your bookshelves if you're interested in this stuff. They are fantastic resources. But several people to me over the years have noted that when they have gone and studied original artifacts from Ewart's various books, including Records of the Medieval Sword here and other books that he wrote, sometimes there is a divergence between what he wrote about the object and the actual object in real life. Now, perhaps most famously, at least within arms and armour circles, there are some swords which he championed as being genuine, which are now widely believed to, unfortunately, be 19th century fakes. Very, very good ones. But that just demonstrates, even someone like Ewart Oakeskott is not infallible. And also, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily a kind of case closed. A couple of those swords are still open to argument and debate and conjecture today. People don't necessarily agree on whether they are completely 19th century fake or whether they include components of medieval originals. So, for example, there is a sword I can think of in the Wallace collection. This isn't one of the swords that has been debated, but there is a sword in the Wallace collection I can think of, which definitely includes original components, but that were almost certainly put together in the 19th century. So the kind of the faking industry, which wasn't always, don't view it in the same light as modern days. It wasn't always intended to deceive. Sometimes they had a bunch of original parts and they thought, well, we may as well put them together to make a nice presentational thing to put in a cabinet in our armoury in our castle or our house. So it wasn't always intended to deceive other people or defraud or anything like that. Sometimes it was purely to make a more presentational object out of some bits and pieces you had lying around that might individually be original pieces. So that's one topic. The other thing which has come up in recent years is attribution. Now, I know that a couple of people are working on this topic, so I'm not going to go into depth on that because I don't want to undermine their publications and things that are coming out. But there are some attributions which Ewart Oakeskott kind of championed, for example, a certain sword having belonged to a certain famous person, where we now have a reasonable amount of evidence to suggest that that was an incorrect attribution, and in some cases we might have a different attribution to give. So again, not to undermine the enormous worth that Ewart Oakeskott's research and writings have brought to the subject. They are an amazing foundation, incomparable really. I mean, there are a few other authors like Claude Blair and A.V.B. Norman and people like that who've written equally monumental works in the field of arms and armour that are equally sort of foundational to what we're doing today. And not to undermine at all what Ewart Oakeskott achieved and how important he was and continues to be, but just really to highlight that with any historical work and any research work, we always have to come back to it later on. We always have to revise our views with new information. And importantly, and this is the purpose of this video, and I'm going to illustrate it with one specific example, not to always take what's in the book as gospel truth. Okay, so this is not a holy work of absolute facts always, and I'm going to demonstrate that with one sword. So it just so happens that relatively recently, a few weeks ago, I was up at the Royal Armouries. And now I didn't at all set out for this to be the case, but it just so happened that I was checking something in records of the medieval sword today, and I ended up flicking through the book, as you often do, and I stumbled across a sword in there that I didn't actually remember was in there, that was one of the swords that I was studying at the Royal Armouries a few weeks ago. And it turns out to be a perfect example of how we shouldn't always trust absolutely what is in this book. Now, I should also mention a fellow researcher, Clive Thomas, who has done far more hands-on studying of significant medieval swords, for example from the Castillon Hoard, from the Alexandria arsenal. He has measured and studied a lot of those swords, and in discussions with Clive, and I don't want to quote him, and I don't want to misquote him more importantly, but we have both noted that there is sometimes a discrepancy between what you find about an object compared to how it's described or measured in records of the medieval swords specifically. So unfortunately, there are measurements given in here which we now subsequently know are wrong. Now, which measurements specifically are we talking about? Well, usually length is the most obvious one, length of blade, total length, and also sometimes weight. So, Ewart Oakeskott, has to be pointed out, studied the medieval swords in here over the course of decades. He didn't do this in the course of a month or even a year, and it seems that he probably didn't keep great records, ironic considering the name of the book, for all of these swords. And so sometimes he was either going off scribbled records, and sometimes memory. And so I have been told that sometimes the measurements or the weights in here are sometimes kind of a guess or a memory. Now, that's an interesting topic that I'm just going to diverge on very briefly for a moment. I myself have handled specific swords in the Wallace collection and the Royal Armouries and various other places. Sometimes more than once. And what's very interesting about an unoriginal object, and you even find this, I even find this in my own antique sword collection, is that sometimes how a sword feels, so what you think its balance might be, whether it's more forwards weighted or whether it's more backwards weighted, whether it's heavy or light or nimble or whatever, can actually vary day to day because it's an utterly subjective and human measure. Okay, so if someone, Ewart Oakeskott, for example, was 20 years later after handling an object thinking, was that heavy or light? Was that heavy or, how did it balance in the hand? And he may have written one thing down based on one or even two handlings of that object that wasn't necessarily accurate. And if he'd handled it again, he probably would have had a completely different experience of that object. And I've even found this with swords, even on the time of day, whether you're fresh out of bed or just arrived at the place you're going to, or whether you're a bit tired, whether you've just handled a bunch of swords before, so you've got a comparative feeling, or whether you're just handling 2, or whether you're handling 50. It gives you a very different, or whether you're particularly fit, whether you're younger, whether you're older, you can have completely different experiences of how things feel in the hand. Right, enough of that tangent. So, coming back to the book, what is this example? Well, it is this sword on the left here, which is in the Royal Armouries, and you may well know that sword. It is a fairly well-known one, and I was looking at this sword myself, taking very detailed measurements of it. My measurements, I am confident to say, you can go to the Royal Armouries. I challenge you to go to the Royal Armouries and come up with a different measurement to what I've come up with. So I weighed this, I measured every little bit of it, I took the balance point, I took the distal taper, everything, okay? So I spent a not inconsiderable amount of time with this specific sword, this one here, and took all of its measurements. Now, there are two things on this page which are really wrong, actually. I can unfortunately say categorically Ewart Oakeskott on this page, and I know this goes for some other swords in here as well, but I won't go into those, I'll just focus on this one. I know that he was categorically wrong on this sword when he gives the blade length. So curiously, we look here, you can see he gives the blade length of 81.9 centimetres. Now that sounds like a confident measure, doesn't it? Because it's 81.9. He hasn't written 82 or 81 and a half. 81.9, that sounds very precise, doesn't it? Well, so I measured that exact same blade of that exact sword, and unless some weird scientific phenomenon has happened in the last 40 years and it has grown, now a blade could possibly shrink due to breakage or a tip being broken off or something like that, or the blade being bent or anything like this. This blade is not bent, incidentally, it is straight. It is not 81.9 centimetres long. So I thought, when I was looking at this, I thought, I remember it being a bit longer than that, so I went and dug out my measurements. What do my measurements say? Well, I wrote 85 centimetres. Now, not only that, but I actually wrote 85.1 centimetres and then subsequently scratched out the 0.1 millimetre. That's how precise I was being, and I decided that it wasn't 85.1, it was actually 85. So, I can confirm that this sword does not have an 81.9 centimetre blade, it has an 85 centimetre blade. Now, is that important? If you're making a replica, hell yes! That's actually not an inconsiderable amount of length. That's not quite a couple of inches, but it's well over an inch, and that is a considerable difference actually in the so yeah, it's over an inch. It's not quite an inch and a half, is it? But it's over an inch. So the difference between 81.9 and 85 centimetres is worth noting. But more importantly, and the purpose of this video is to point out, we can't always take, even when something seems precise like that 81.9, we can't always take it as gospel unless we've got cross-references, other people have checked it, or we've checked it, or whatever. Okay, so I thought, well, you know, maybe he scribbled something down, maybe he'd scribbled down 84.9, and then either in the editing or in his writing he made a typo and it came out as 81.9, it should have been 84.9, because, you know, if he'd measured it as 84.9 and I measured it as 85, well, 1 millimetre. What's 1 millimetre between friends? But that would be a small difference and I wouldn't even mention it, but 81.9 is a considerable difference. Now I thought that the differences would be ended there. However, there is another one. And so he goes into some length on this page describing this very cool pommel. Now this pommel, as he notes, he only knows 3 examples like that, I think we might know more actually by now, but I won't go into that. But he goes into some length describing this pommel, and then he draws the pommel down here. Now, unfortunately, that drawing's completely wrong. Now, I know, because again, I spent quite some time with this sword, and I drew the pommel myself. And not only that, I have numerous photographs of the pommel. I have in the region of 10 or 12 photographs just of the pommel of this sword. And it is not like that. He's done the cross-section wrong. So I can only assume he did this from memory. Now, I won't go into the details of how it was wrong. In time, you will see my measurements and you'll see the results of the work that I've been doing. But I can tell you that that one there is wrong. So once again, not to undermine the enormous accomplishments of Ewart Oakeskott and how personally grateful I am for inspiring my study in arms and armour. What he published, what he achieved was amazing, okay? But this is a great example of a page which has a lot of data on it, a lot of detail, even a detailed cross-sectional drawing of a pommel, where unfortunately we've got 2 major pieces of information that are wrong. The blade length is completely wrong and the pommel drawing is completely wrong. So a lesson to us all: history books, they are what they are, and unfortunately they sometimes contain errors. Some history books contain more errors than others. Some history books I've read contain a lot of errors, especially on the topic of arms and armour. Records of the medieval sword is still absolutely worth having, but when you're dealing with measurements in here, particularly weights and lengths, treat it with a pinch of salt. And if you can gain access to better photos, better measurements, more recent measurements, particularly with weighing, I have to say, then do so, okay? And if you're in the business of making replicas or commissioning replicas to get made, don't only base it on records of the medieval sword, because you might end up with a very nice sword, but it won't probably be particularly close to the original. So I hope that's been useful and interesting. Once again, I am, like all of us, I think, probably watching this channel, hugely indebted to Ewart Oakeskott's books, and I always recommend that you get all of them because they are fantastic. Not only are they fantastic resources, but they're also written very well and a pleasure to read. He was a good author. So there we go. Take from that what you will, and hopefully in time we will all have access to even more data and even more photographs and measurements and cross-sectional drawings and everything else of these wonderful artifacts that have survived to us. And I have to also mention, there are some swords which are currently, their whereabouts is unknown and have only survived in books like this because this was written in the 80s. And some of those swords, he had old photos of them, which even at that point, his photos were old and he didn't know the whereabouts anymore. So some of these swords are lost. Hopefully they'll turn up in time, and we might find that their lengths and weights are somewhat different to what was quoted in records of the medieval sword. But nevertheless, it's a great work. Get it if you don't have it. I'll put a link below to the book, actually. And thanks for watching. If you haven't liked and subscribed, please do so, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks.